I woke up to my mother shouting. My mom never shouts, so I flew out of bed and down the stairs to see what was wrong. She was standing in front of the TV, and as I entered, she pointed to the screen. I gasped. Never in a million years had I expected the sight that greeted me. A girl was on the news, thin and dirt-streaked with wild eyes. She was surrounded by police who were leading her toward her home, while reporters shoved microphones in her face. It was like seeing a ghost. Exactly like seeing a ghost. Because you see, the girl was my best friend, Jess, and 1 year ago, Jess disappeared. The caption on the screen read, "Missing girl found. Police hunt for suspect." Jess had been kidnapped? I'd imagined so many things over the past 12 months. Jess is dead. Jess lost somewhere in the woods trying to survive. But most of all, I'd imagined the day Jess would come back. The day my phone would ring and it would be her voice on the other end, with some excuse for where she'd been. I couldn't believe that day was here. As I pulled out my phone to call her, the voices on screen got louder. Reporters followed Jess and her bodyguards to the front of her house, still shouting questions as Jess was led inside and the door slammed. A studio reporter promised further news as the case unfolded and showed a police sketch of the kidnapping suspect, a skinny blonde woman. I dialed Jess, but no one answered. I told myself maybe she had a new phone, or maybe she was too traumatized to talk yet. But days went by and I didn't hear anything. I was her best friend. Wasn't I one of the first people she'd want to see? Finally, I got forwarded an invite on social media for a welcome home party for Jess at our friend Stacy's house. I was so excited and nervous to see her. I was greeted at the door by a bunch of girls asking if I'd heard what happened to Jess. And did I know she'd come to the party with a cop guarding her? All anybody could talk about was Jess and the details of her kidnapping. All I wanted to do was talk to Jess. She was in the kitchen, describing how she'd been walking home when a woman in a van offered her a ride. She'd felt safe since the driver was a woman. But as they drove, the woman suddenly took a turn that led out of town. Jess told her they were going the wrong way, but the woman ignored her. Jess tried to get out of the car, but the child locks were on. The woman took her to an old house in the woods and locked her in the basement. She'd kept Jess there for months, barely feeding her until finally she attacked her captor when she opened the door and escaped. I listened, horrified. This was the craziest story I'd ever heard in my life, and I couldn't believe it had happened to someone I knew. But another feeling was surfacing too, jealousy. People were hanging on Jess's every word. It had always been that way with us. Jess, the star of the show. Me, a quiet little mouse in the corner. I was ashamed of my feelings, though. Jess had just been through a terrible ordeal. She deserved sympathy. Finally, Jess spotted me, and I started to smile. But it was like looking into a stranger's eyes. There was no warmth or happiness in them. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. I said somebody had forwarded me the invitation. "How dare you show your face here?" She got in my face, and then I heard the most shocking words of my life. "This is all your fault, Francie. You're the reason this happened to me." I couldn't speak, but I could feel more and more people staring at us. "Jess," I said, "what are you talking about?" She looked around to make sure everyone was still watching her. Of course they were. She pointed at me. "You made me walk home alone that day. That's when I was taken." I was so confused. I remembered that the day before Jess vanished, we'd been walking to her house after school like usual. We'd gotten into a stupid fight and I had stormed off to my house instead. But according to news reports, the last person to see her had been Kat, a college girl she'd been hanging out with. And that was the morning after she and I fought. I said that, but Jess's cold expression didn't change. She said Kat had gotten the date wrong, that the last person she'd seen was me. I remember all the horrible hours of police questioning me last year, the cops asking what I knew about Kat. Even though I couldn't believe Jess was blaming me, some weird part of me felt special that I'd been the last person to see Jess, not Kat. But Jess wasn't done. "Get out!" she shouted. "I never want to see you again. You disgust me." I was so mad. "It's not my fault that you were dumb enough to hitchhike," I shouted back. Her face turned red, and she grabbed a handful of cake from the pan on the counter and smashed it into my face. I stood there with icing stuck in my eyes and hair, even up my nose. People laughed and whooped, and someone told us both to calm down, but it was too late. I shoved her entire face into the cake pan and left. The next morning, I had a zillion notifications on my phone. People were sharing videos and pictures of my argument with Jess and talking about how horrible I was. At school, people whispered and stared. By lunchtime, rumors were flying, including one that I had hired somebody to kidnap Jess. I was in tears by the time I got home. I tried to remember my fight with Jess last year. We'd been planning to work on a project at her house, but she was ignoring me to text with Kat, which had been happening a lot. I was mad because I'd been Jess's BFF since kindergarten, had let her sleep over my house so many times when her parents were being awful to her, and now she was ditching me for some college girl. I finally snapped that if Kat was so great, maybe Jess should go do the project with her. That was when I stormed away, leaving Jess to walk home alone. But I still couldn't believe she thought the kidnapping was my fault, and that she'd convinced everyone I was the enemy. Even if I was the last person to see Jess, that didn't make me responsible. The only choice was to talk to Jess and get this all straightened out. When I arrived at her house, I realized my mistake. There were still reporters camped out on her lawn, and they shouted questions at me as I pushed through. I knocked on the door. Jess's mom answered, only opening the door a crack. As soon as she saw who I was, she started screaming that she couldn't believe what I'd done to Jess, ordering me to never come here again. Humiliation burned through me for the second time in 2 days. This time, instead of the eyes of my classmates on me, it was the eyes of reporters and their cameras. I ran home as fast as I could. That night, my confrontation with Jess's mom was on the news. My own parents were shocked. "What does she mean, what you did to Jess?" my mom asked. The whole story spilled out. My mom tried to be on my side, but she also said, "How could you let Jess walk home alone? You know girls shouldn't walk alone in this town." In the space of a few days, my life had become a nightmare. My own mother blamed me for Jess's kidnapping. Everyone at school thought I was a monster, and I'd been humiliated on TV. And then it got worse. The next day before school, 2 cops showed up at my house. They needed to question me again, since they now thought I was the last person Jess had spoken to before her abduction. I was so freaked out. What if they decided I was responsible for what happened? Could they arrest me? I went with them and my mom to the station. When they finally let me go hours later, I was exhausted. My mom gave me a long hug and apologized for saying I shouldn't have left Jess to walk alone. "What happened is not your fault," she told me. "Try telling that to my school," I wanted to shout. Luckily, the next morning, something happened to finally take their attention off me. It was Jess's first day back at school. She arrived with her cop bodyguard. Everyone wanted to talk to her. Everyone wanted to eat lunch with her. She was like a celebrity. It was so annoying. When Jess and I had class together, she wouldn't even look at me. This was the way she treated her best friend who'd always been there for her? Jess's bag was on the floor and her phone was sticking out. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I wanted to see how many messages the famous Jess had on her phone. Maybe I wanted her to be scared when she realized it was gone. Scared like I'd been when I'd realized she was gone. So I took it. My heart pounded for the rest of class, waiting to see if Jess would notice. But when the bell rang, she grabbed her bag and left the room. After everyone had left, her phone buzzed. A message from Kat. "Why did you mess with our story? Now the cops are questioning me again." What was she talking about? I scrolled back through the text thread. A lot of it didn't make sense. Like messages had been deleted. Just then, Jess came running back in. "Francie," she sounded panicked. "Have you seen my—" She stopped when she saw me with the phone and said if I didn't give it back, she'd call the cops and say I stole it. I was so furious. I yelled, "I'll tell the cops you're lying about being kidnapped." I didn't even know for sure that she was lying, but she looked so scared when I said that. I told her I'd seen the texts from Kat. I expected her to be mad. Instead, she broke down sobbing, and then she told me the whole story. After I'd stormed out on her that day, she'd gone to Kat's house. She told Kat how terrible everything in her life was. She hated her parents, she hated school, and even I didn't like her anymore. She said she wanted to run away. Kat knew about an old abandoned cabin where Jess could stay, and Kat would bring her food every week. Jess could disappear, leave her whole life behind. So Jess agreed, but eventually she got lonely and wanted to come back. Why did you make up that freaky story about being kidnapped? She said she was mad that nobody even noticed that she was gone. Her parents had barely tried to look for her. The police had given up after a few months. But the biggest betrayal was that I had stopped looking for her. I was shocked that she thought that. I told her that I'd watched the news every day after she disappeared, hoping she'd come back. I called her phone constantly. Even though we'd fought, I never thought that meant we weren't friends anymore. Don't tell anyone I lied, okay? She said. Oh my God, she really had issues. She tried to ruin my life, and now she wanted me to lie for her? Please, Francie, you're the only real friend I've ever had. I didn't even know whether to believe her. Was she just manipulating me like she'd done to everyone else? I told her she had to tell the truth, or I would. She did, and over the next few days, the story at school changed from what a monster I was to how Jess was so crazy and had made the whole thing up. Jess's family decided to move out of state. She called me right before the move and asked if we could still be friends. I said I forgave her and that I hoped that she would find peace and happiness someday. But we couldn't be friends again, not after what she'd done. I felt terrible after we hung up, but I knew I was doing the right thing. I still think about her often and hope she gets to experience real love, not just the attention she gets from making up stories.